If you have ever held the door for a stranger, let someone merge, answered a question you didn't have to answer, or signed your name without reading every line, you have already participated in the system people call harmless. Because most harm does not arrive as a threat. It arrives as a sequence, a chain of small, reasonable actions that make sense in the moment and only become terrifying when you look back and realize the moment never ended. We live inside systems that depend on human shortcuts. A line that moves faster because someone steps aside. A form that clears because a blank field is close enough. A schedule that works because somebody covers one last hour. A name entered into the right box. A signature placed where a signature is needed. Most days, nothing happens. The city keeps running. The lights cycle. Traffic flows. Packages arrive. Emails confirm. Receipts print. The world stays smooth enough that you stop noticing how fragile smoothness is. But the butterfly effect is not magic. It is math. It is the reality that cause does not need to be dramatic to be permanent. That the smallest decision can travel farther than the person who made it. That consequences are patient and they do not announce themselves when they begin. They wait until the chain is complete. Until the paperwork becomes policy. Until a name becomes a record. Until a favor becomes a signature. Until a minor accommodation becomes a pathway. And by the time you feel the weight of it, you are not standing at the beginning anymore. You are living inside the aftermath. That is the part people don't talk about. Not the moment you made the choice, but the way it changes the shape of your everyday life afterward. The way normal starts to feel staged. The way routine becomes suspicious. The way you hesitate before doing the kind thing, not because you become cruel, but because you've learned how far kindness can reach when it lands in the wrong hands. Because butterfly effect horror is not about villains hiding in shadows. It is about the quiet dread of realizing you were useful to something you never understood. That your name, your timing, your compliance, your generosity, your instinct to keep things moving became a link in a chain you cannot see. Tonight, these are not stories about people who made reckless choices. They are not stories about thrill seekers or rule breakers or anyone who should have known better. They are stories about ordinary people in ordinary places who did what you would do. They tried to be helpful. They followed the process. They made the polite choice. They did the small thing that keeps the day from turning into an argument. And then they watched their lives narrow in ways no one else could understand. 3 stories, 3 chains, 3 moments that seemed insignificant at the time. So pay attention to the smallest choices you make without thinking. Not because every action will ruin your life, but because the world is full of systems that are built to carry your actions forward long after you have stopped looking at them. And whatever comes next does not need to rush. It only needs you to do one small thing the way you always do. Then it will let the chain do the rest. Story 1. I let him go first. I still remember the sound of the rain that day, not because it was violent, but because it was steady, patient. Portland rain rarely feels like weather. It feels like a setting that refuses to change. It slicked the sidewalks into dark glass, turned the crosswalk paint into pale ribbons, and made the city smell like wet cedar and old concrete. I was in line for something unimportant. That is the truth I can't get away from, no matter how many times I replay the moment. It was a weekday afternoon, the kind of gray that makes even noon look like the sun forgot you existed. I had ducked into a small building off a busier street, one of those public-facing places where you go to prove you are yourself. I needed a replacement card, or a stamp, or a renewal, something I thought would take 10 minutes. The lobby was warm in the way public places are warm. Heat leaking from vents, people carrying dampness in with them, coats breathing out rain. The floor was linoleum. The lighting was fluorescent and tired. The air held a faint tang of paper, printer ink, and wet wool. There were maybe 8 people in line. The usual Portland mix: a man with mud on his boots, a woman in a rain jacket holding a folder to her chest like armor, someone on a phone call speaking in soft, urgent bursts. It was quiet in the careful way people get around forms and clipboards, like noise might cost them their place. I stood behind a guy who looked like he'd been there longer than anyone else. He wasn't older, not really, maybe early 30s, but his posture had a kind of worn-out tension, shoulders tight, hands clasped together at his waist. His jacket was black and soaked at the seams, and he kept glancing up at a digital screen that flashed ticket numbers. He didn't have a ticket in his hand. I noticed because I had mine, a little strip of thermal paper, curling at the edges. The number printed in thick black ink. He kept patting his pockets like he couldn't find something. I thought, at first, he was looking for his phone. He turned, finally, and looked at me. "Sorry," he said, voice low. "Do you know where you grab the tickets for the line?" I walked in and got behind people, but I think I missed something. It was a simple question. It could have ended right there. I could have told him. I could have pointed to the dispenser mounted on the wall near the entrance. I could have said, "You're going to have to go back and take one, man." That is what would have been correct. Instead, I looked at his face and saw something I didn't know how to interpret. Not panic, not anger, just that hollow urgency people get when they've already been late to something important. His eyes flicked toward the service windows, toward the employees behind glass partitions with their headsets and their careful, regulated expressions. He swallowed once, like he was forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm supposed to be somewhere," he added. I can't do this again. Again." The word caught on my attention like a burr. I don't know what made me do it. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't pity. It was probably my Portland reflex. That soft, social instinct to keep things moving, to avoid confrontation, to be kind in small ways because it's easier than being precise. "Here," I said, and held out my ticket. His eyes widened slightly. "No, I can't. I mean, it's fine," I said. "I'm not in a hurry." That wasn't even true. I had a meeting later. I had a list of errands. I had plans. But in that moment, it felt easier to trade away a few minutes than to watch him go back to the dispenser and lose his place and maybe have some kind of quiet breakdown in the lobby. He stared at the paper like it was radioactive. "You sure?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it in the small way you mean things you don't understand the weight of. "Go first." He took it like he was afraid I'd change my mind. His fingers brushed mine, cold and damp. He muttered, "Thank you." He turned away, holding the ticket in his fist, and slipped into the line as if he'd always belonged there. I stepped out, walked back to the dispenser, and took another ticket. My new number was 27 ahead of his. I remember that because I looked at it and laughed quietly, not out loud, just in my chest. Typical, the small punishment for trying to be helpful. I tucked it into my pocket, leaned against the wall, and resigned myself to waiting. The lobby was slow. Numbers blinked forward like they were being dragged. People shifted their weight, checked their phones, wiped rain off their glasses. The guy I let go first, he stood at the counter when his number flashed. I watched him through the glass partition. He spoke to the clerk with a kind of rigid control, hands flat on the counter, shoulders squared, jaw tight. The clerk typed, paused, frowned, typed again. I watched his face change. He leaned forward, said something I couldn't hear. The clerk's mouth moved, calm, professional. The guy's throat bobbed. He nodded once, too sharp, then leaned in again. The clerk disappeared into a back room. The guy waited, eyes fixed on a point above the counter, like he was trying not to blink. His fingers tapped against the edge of the counter in a rhythm that wasn't nervous so much as deliberate. A coded signal, a countdown. He looked over his shoulder once. His eyes landed on me. I don't know if he recognized me. I don't know if he registered me at all. He just looked, and for a split second his expression opened up like a crack in ice. It wasn't gratitude. It was something like relief, but twisted. Like relief that was also regret. Then the clerk came back, another employee with her, both of them holding a folder. The guy took it, opened it, glanced at whatever was inside. His shoulders dropped a fraction. He nodded, thanked them again, and left. That was it. That was the entire moment. The whole exchange took, maybe, 5 minutes. He was gone before my number was even close. I remember watching the door close behind him, and the rain swallowing him into the gray outside. Then I looked down at my new ticket, sighed, and went back to waiting. I never thought about him again, not for months. Not until the first time I saw his name. It wasn't immediate. That's the thing that makes people roll their eyes when I start telling this. The world doesn't flip upside down in an hour. It doesn't announce itself. It drips. The first time, it was a street sign. I was driving through a neighborhood I didn't usually cut through, a part of the city where houses lean close to the sidewalk and every porch has a bike chained to it. I stopped at a four-way stop, windshield wipers squeaking, and saw a green street sign at the corner. The name on it matched the name I'd seen on the ticket number display that day, not the number, the little thing above it. The clerk had called it out, loud enough that it carried across the lobby. "Calder," she'd said, when my number came up, and I'd stepped forward. I remembered that because it's my name. This street sign wasn't my name. It was his. I stared at it longer than made sense. It was a common name, I told myself. Portland is full of names on street signs. There are hundreds of streets, thousands of names. It meant nothing. I drove on, forgot about it. Then, a week later, it was on the news. I was eating dinner alone, the television murmuring in the background because silence makes the apartment feel too big. Local segment. Something about an incident downtown. A blurred image from a security camera. A reporter in a rain jacket, standing in front of police tape. The name flashed on the screen beneath the reporter's face. It was his name again. I sat up straighter without realizing. The reporter said it casually, like it was one more fact in a list of facts. A suspect, a person of interest, an ongoing investigation. The story was vague, intentionally so. They said there was no danger to the public. They said authorities were asking for anyone with information to come forward. They used his full name. I had not known his full name before, but hearing it, I knew it in my bones, like my mind had been holding it in a locked room, waiting for the right key. I turned off the television. I stood at my sink and washed my plate too aggressively. The water ran hot. Steam rose. My hands trembled. I told myself it was coincidence. Coincidence is the word you cling to when you don't want to become a person who sees patterns everywhere. I tried to let it go. Then it showed up in the mail. A month after the news segment, I got an envelope with a city seal on the front. Official, heavy paper. My name printed in block letters. My address. I thought, at first, it was a tax thing. A parking ticket. Some dull bureaucratic reminder. I opened it at my kitchen counter. Inside was a notice about jury duty. Nothing unusual. I'd gotten one before, years ago, but this one had a case number listed, and beneath it, in clean typed text, it named the defendant. The name was his. I read it 3 times before it made sense. I wasn't just being summoned for jury duty. I was being summoned for his case. The paper trembled in my hands. I could hear my refrigerator humming behind me, steady as a heartbeat. That was the moment the first real dread seeped into my life. Not panic, not fear, but that sinking sense that something you thought was in the past has been quietly walking beside you and only now has stepped closer. I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the summons. I should have thrown it away. I should have called and asked to be excused. I should have told myself I couldn't possibly be impartial, that I had some strange connection, however small. Instead, I did what I always do with official paperwork. I followed the instructions. I showed up when the letter told me to. That is how it always begins, with compliance. The courthouse downtown is a building that makes you feel small. Stone columns, metal detectors, the smell of old paper and coffee that's been sitting too long. People murmuring in lines, everyone holding folders, everyone with the same tight expression that says, "I don't want to be here." I sat in a room with dozens of other potential jurors. A television in the corner played a looped informational video about civic duty. The narrator's voice was cheerful, sterile. We were called in groups. Names were read. People stood, filed out. When my group was called, I walked into the courtroom, and the first thing I saw was him. He was seated at the defendant's table, wearing a suit that didn't fit quite right, hands folded, eyes down. His hair was shorter than I remembered, but his posture was the same. That rigid control, that tension coiled like wire beneath the surface. My throat went dry. He looked up at the judge, not at us. He didn't glance toward the jury box. He didn't seem to scan faces. Then his eyes flicked, just once, toward the row of potential jurors. They landed on me. I felt it like being touched. He didn't react. He didn't widen his eyes, didn't stiffen, didn't show recognition in any obvious way. His face stayed calm, controlled. almost blank. But his mouth twitched at one corner, so briefly I might have imagined it. Not a smile, a signal. I sat down. My palms were damp. The wood of the jury bench felt cold through my slacks. The judge spoke. The attorneys spoke. Questions were asked about bias, about experience, about whether we knew anyone involved in the case. My heart hammered so loudly I barely heard my own answers. When they asked if anyone recognized the defendant, I wanted to raise my hand. My arm did not move. Because the truth was, I didn't recognize him in the way they meant. I didn't know him. I didn't have his phone number. I didn't know where he lived. I didn't know what he did for work. I only knew I let him go first in line. That felt insane to say out loud. It felt like a paranoid confession, like the beginning of a story someone would mock online. So I kept my hand down. The attorneys dismissed some jurors. Others were selected. I wasn't chosen. I should have been relieved. Instead, when I walked out of the courthouse into the drizzle, I felt hollow, like I'd been spared something I didn't understand. I tried to forget again. That lasted maybe 2 weeks. Then, the first time it touched my everyday life, it wasn't a street sign or a letter. It was a casual conversation. I was at a coffee shop near my apartment, one of those places with reclaimed wood tables and plants hanging in the window. I was waiting for my drink when I overheard 2 people behind me talking. They sounded like coworkers. One of them, a woman with a scarf wrapped around her neck, said, "My cousin is freaking out. She's like, I was in line behind him once, and now she thinks she's cursed." The other person laughed. "People are so dramatic," the woman said. "No, seriously. She said she was behind him at some office, like years ago. She said she remembers him because he asked to cut." I froze. My name was called for my drink. I didn't move. The woman kept talking. She was like, "I let him go first," she said, voice dropping like it was gossip. "And now she thinks she started it." My stomach turned. My drink sat on the counter steaming, the cup sweating, my name written in marker. Evan. I picked it up with shaking fingers and walked out without looking at them. Outside, the rain had picked up. Cars hissed on wet pavement. My breath fogged in the cold. I stood under the awning and tried to steady myself. It could be coincidence, I told myself. It could be a different office, a different line, a different person. Lots of people cut lines. Lots of people let others go first. But the phrasing was too close. The details were too close. The most terrifying part was not that someone else might have had the same experience. It was that someone else might have been tracing the same chain, feeling the same invisible tug, and instead of it being a private madness, it was becoming a shared pattern. Patterns spread. Patterns become systems. That night, I went down a rabbit hole. I told myself I wouldn't. I searched his name online. Articles, court filings, comment sections full of strangers arguing about guilt and innocence, people dissecting details like it was entertainment. I read until my eyes burned. The case was ugly, but not the kind of sensational ugly that makes headlines nationwide. It was the slow ugly of modern life. Missing documents, miscommunication, a timeline filled with administrative gaps. An event that, according to the reporting, might have been prevented if one small thing had been noticed earlier. A missed appointment, a delayed filing, a call that didn't get returned. All normal failures, all every day. But as I read, I kept seeing echoes of that day in the lobby. The folder, the clerk disappearing into the back room, the guy's rigid posture. He had been there to correct something, to retrieve something, to ensure a piece of paper existed in the right place at the right time. I scrolled through an article that included a reconstruction of events based on documents and interviews. One line stopped me cold. It described how a certain form had been processed earlier than expected due to an unusually fast service appointment. Fast service appointment. My mouth went dry. I stared at the screen. My mind did what minds do when they're terrified. It began connecting dots. If he hadn't cut the line, would he have gotten that form in time? If he hadn't gotten it, would the next link in the chain have happened? If the next link hadn't happened, would the outcome have changed? I wasn't looking for guilt. I wasn't looking for absolution. I was looking for a way to understand why his name had begun weaving itself through my life like thread. I closed my laptop. I sat in my dark living room, listening to the rain hit the window, and felt something shift inside me. Not fear of him, fear of the chain. Because the chain didn't end with him. The chain was continuing. It was still moving through the city, through paperwork, through conversations, through news segments, through street signs, and I had touched it. After that, the dread became domestic. It wasn't dramatic. It was constant. I started noticing the way my daily life was marked by small, official things. Receipts, confirmation emails, appointment reminders, forms to sign, buttons to click that said submit or confirm or continue. Every time I did, I felt like I was pushing an unseen domino. I began hesitating in lines, not because I was afraid of being polite, but because I was afraid of being decisive. If someone asked to go ahead of me, my chest tightened. If I considered letting them, my mind flashed forward into futures I couldn't see. So I stopped letting people go first. I became the kind of person who doesn't make eye contact in line. I became the kind of person who grips their ticket like it's a boundary. I told myself it was just stress, just anxiety, just the world being heavier lately. But the universe, or whatever you want to call it, kept slipping his name into my life like it was testing my attention. A street sign again, a passing mention on the radio, a documentary clip recommended on my streaming app, thumbnail showing a blurred surveillance still. Once, I was walking along the river and saw a memorial plaque on a bench, one of those small metal plates screwed into wood. It had a name engraved, and for a second, my heart stopped. It wasn't his name. It was mine, Evan Calder. I stared at it until my vision went fuzzy. Of course, it was my name. It could have been placed there by anyone. It could have been for someone else with the same name. It meant nothing, but it felt like a response, like the city was quietly whispering, "You're not outside this." The worst part is that none of this ruins your life in a way anyone can see. There's no dramatic breakdown, no confrontation, no moment where you can point and say, "Here, this is the horror." It becomes the way you move through the world. It becomes the way you think about doors that close behind you, about elevators you step into with strangers, about forms you sign without reading the fine print because you trust the system. I stopped trusting the system, not in a rebellious way. In a careful, exhausted way, I started reading everything twice. I started taking screenshots of confirmations, saving emails, keeping copies of documents in folders on my computer labeled by date. I started writing down small decisions. I kept a notebook by my door. At first, it was a joke, a way to ground myself. I would scribble things like paid rent, called mom, went to grocery store. Then I started writing other things. Let the guy merge, held the door, corrected the clerk, little actions, little ripple points. I don't know what I thought I was doing. Creating a record, maybe, of where the chain might begin next, as if I could track it, as if I could defend myself with documentation. Months passed. Then, one evening, I found a letter tucked under my door. No stamp, no envelope, just folded paper. My name written on the front in blocky handwriting. Evan Calder. I stared at it for a long time before touching it. The hallway outside my apartment was quiet, dim. The smell of someone's cooking drifted under doors. A distant television murmured behind a wall. I picked up the paper like it might bite me. Inside was a single sentence. You did what you were supposed to do. That was all. No signature, no explanation. My skin prickled. I read it again, slower. You did what you were supposed to do. It sounded like reassurance, but it felt like a verdict. I shut my door, locked it, and stood with my back against it, heart pounding. I tried to tell myself someone was messing with me. A neighbor, a prank, some weird local thing. Then I noticed the paper. It wasn't notebook paper. It wasn't printer paper. It was a strip of thermal paper, like the kind ticket dispensers use. The edges were slightly curled. It smelled faintly of warm plastic and ink. My stomach dropped. I held it up under the kitchen light. On the back, faint, almost invisible unless you tilted it, were the ghosted remnants of a printed number, a queue ticket. The same kind I had handed him. I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at that strip of paper until my eyes watered. I thought about the day in the lobby, the way he'd taken my ticket like it mattered, the way he'd looked at me, relief twisted with something else. I thought about how systems don't care about intent. They care about sequence, timing, placement, I thought about how I had stepped out of line, how I had physically moved myself backward, and how that one small choice had given him access to a window of time I didn't understand. And then, in my head, a thought formed so calmly, it was worse than panic. What if he hadn't been asking for the ticket because he didn't know where to get one? What if he had been asking because he needed someone to choose, someone to move themselves, someone to take the other number? I stood up too fast, chair scraping, and went to my front door. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but as I watched, the elevator at the end of the hall dinged softly. The doors opened. No one stepped out. The doors stayed open for a moment, like they were waiting for someone, then closed again. I stood there, my breath shallow, staring at my own reflection in the peephole glass. I thought about the note in my hand. You did what you were supposed to do. And I realized something that made my mouth go dry. For years, I had been thinking of that moment as a kindness, as a choice I made freely. But in every chain, there is a link that looks like agency. And really, it's just the point where the system needs a human hand to keep moving. I looked down at the thermal paper again, the faint ghost of a number on the back. Then I turned it over. On the front, in the same blocky handwriting, someone had written a new sentence, one I hadn't seen because my hands were shaking too much at first. You can let the next one go first, too. I stared at it until the words blurred. Outside my window, the rain kept falling, steady and patient, turning the city into slick glass. And somewhere in Portland, someone was standing in line for something unimportant, clutching a ticket, waiting for their number to be called, waiting for someone behind them to decide whether to be kind. Story 2, filed as requested. I learned early that paperwork has a smell, not the crisp, clean scent you imagine when you picture a fresh notebook, but the dull, absorbent odor of handled pages, toner dust, and stale air trapped in file rooms. It clings to your fingertips. It lingers in the folds of your clothes when you leave. You carry it home without meaning to, like smoke from a fire you never saw. For 3 months, that smell was my life. I was between jobs. That sounds cleaner than it felt. I had a degree I'd stopped believing in, a resume I kept rewriting like it might suddenly become a different person, and a string of interviews that ended with polite smiles and promises that never materialized. When the temp agency called and offered me a short-term clerical placement, I said yes before the woman on the phone finished the sentence. Harbor Point Administrative Services, she said. Downtown, Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. Data processing. I asked what kind of data. Records, she said, as if that was an entire universe. It was. The building sat in an older stretch of downtown, the kind of place where the city's newer glass towers cast long shadows over brick facades that have survived everything by simply refusing to move. Harbor Point was on the 6th floor, behind a smoked glass door with a brushed metal plaque. Inside, the lighting was a pale, constant hum. The air was too dry, like it had been filtered, until it forgot what outside felt like. My supervisor's name was Janice Kerr. She had a voice that never rose above, "This is how we do it," and a neat blonde bob that looked freshly cut every week. She gave me a badge, a password, and a laminated sheet of procedures that might as well have been scripture. "You'll be in intake," she said, leading me past rows of desks divided by low partitions. "You'll process incoming submissions from clients, verify required fields, log them, route them. If anything is missing, you reject and send it back with a note." "Clients," I repeated. Janice paused, then smiled the kind of smile that tells you you've asked a question you don't need the answer to. "Various," she said. "Contract work." That should have bothered me, the vagueness. The way the office felt like it existed to keep something at arm's length. But I was grateful for the paycheck, and grateful is a powerful blindfold. Intake was a small corner of the floor near the printers, which meant the air was always slightly warm and faintly metallic. The printers were industrial, the kind that could swallow a stack of paper and spit it out, collated, stapled, and hole-punched without complaint. They made the same sounds all day, a rhythmic churn and click that became the soundtrack to my thoughts. My job was simple. Most temp work is simple. Simplicity is the trap. I logged submissions. I checked boxes. I ensured names matched IDs. I highlighted missing signatures. I stamped dates. I scanned documents into the system, attached them to digital cases, and routed them to departments with names like review and compliance and quality assurance. Each day, I processed between 80 and 100 files. 80 to 100 lives, reduced to paper. Most were mundane. Someone changing an address, someone disputing a fee, someone requesting access to records. Some contained more personal details than I wanted to see. Medical codes, incident reports, complaints typed in shaky fonts. I learned to keep my face neutral no matter what I read. Janice called it professional distance. I called it survival. I was 2 weeks in when I made the decision that changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday, late afternoon. The kind of time when the office light shifts from day to evening and the windows turn into dark mirrors. People start checking the clock more often. The hum of the building changes, elevators running less frequently, the floor settling into that end-of-day fatigue. Janice came by my desk with a manila folder and the look she wore when she didn't want to have a conversation. Last-minute add-on, she said. Priority. Needs to be entered before close. Okay, I said, taking the folder. She hesitated, then added, follow the checklist, no deviations. I nodded, because that's what you do. The folder was thinner than most. A handful of pages, a cover sheet, a couple of attachments. The cover sheet had a name, Caleb Mercer. I remember the name because it didn't fit the office. It felt too human, too complete, like a person you might actually meet, not an entry in a database. The request type was coded in a shorthand I'd learned to interpret. It wasn't a dispute. It wasn't an address update. It was something more formal, something tied to a determination. Those were the files that made people's shoulders tighten when they walked past intake. The cover sheet had checkboxes for required components, proof of identity, supporting documentation, witness statement, if applicable. All boxes were checked. I flipped to the second page. It was a typed narrative, one paragraph, explaining the request. Most narratives were long, rambling, full of emotion. This one was controlled, written like someone who had read instructions carefully and was trying not to sound desperate. He described an incident, an error, a timeline. He noted dates with precision. He referenced a previous submission and included a case number. He asked for a correction. At the bottom, there was a signature line. It was signed, but the date next to the signature was blank. That was it. That was the inconsistency, a missing date. On any other day, I would have flagged it. The checklist said, signature and date required. Missing date meant rejection. Rejection meant the file bounced back. The clock reset. Another waiting period. Another delay. I stared at the blank date, and something inside me did a quick, uncomfortable calculation. It was 4:20. The office closed at 4:30. Janice had said priority. If I rejected it, it would sit. If I routed it, it would at least move. I looked over the narrative again. It was clear this person had already been waiting for a long time. The case number referenced a submission from months earlier. He mentioned missed deadlines caused by processing delays. He wrote like someone who had learned that any sign of emotion could be used against him. I imagined him printing this out at a library. The paper warm from the machine, rereading it for typos, checking boxes, making sure he did everything right, then realizing at the last second he'd forgotten to write the date next to his signature. It's such an easy thing to forget. A date. It's so small it almost doesn't count as information. I could have rejected it. That would have been correct. Instead, I did what I had started doing without realizing. I made a small accommodation for the system. I told myself it wasn't a deviation, it was a judgment call. On the checklist, there was a line. If minor discrepancy, route to review with note. It was vague. It was probably meant for situations like this. I wrote a small note in the routing field. Signature present, date missing. Please advise. Then I scanned the file, attached it to the case number, and routed it to review. At 4:27, the system logged my action. At 4:30, the lights above intake dimmed slightly, the building shifting into evening mode. I shut down my computer, grabbed my coat, and left. I didn't think about Caleb Mercer again for months. That's the truth. If you had asked me, I wouldn't have remembered his name. I wouldn't have remembered the blank date. It was one file among hundreds. The only reason I remember it now is because it followed me out of the office, quietly, patiently, the way consequences do. I finished the temp contract. I found a new job in a different industry. My life moved on the way lives move on when you keep walking forward. Then, one morning, I received a letter. It wasn't from Harbor Point. It wasn't even addressed to them. It was addressed to me, at my new apartment, with my name typed cleanly on the envelope. No return address, just a postmark from Cleveland. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, like a notice. At the top in bold was a heading, Notice of Action. Below it was a paragraph of bureaucratic language, the kind that is designed to sound final, while revealing as little as possible. It referenced a case number. I stared at the case number until my eyes began to ache. I knew it. I shouldn't have, but I did. Caleb Mercer's case number. My throat went tight. The apartment felt suddenly too quiet, the refrigerator humming, the distant sound of traffic outside my window muted by winter air. I read the notice again, slower. It stated that a determination had been made, and that the result would remain unchanged. It included a line about submission received and logged per protocol. Per protocol. At the bottom, there was a signature, printed, not handwritten, a name I didn't recognize. The title was generic. Then, in the corner, in faint gray, was a system stamp, processed by Intake M. Holt. I sat down at my kitchen table so abruptly the chair scraped the floor. Processed by Intake M. Holt. It was a record, a fingerprint, a line in a database that had somehow surfaced outside its normal channels and landed in my hands. I told myself it was a mistake, a clerical error, irony maybe. But that was the first moment I understood something I hadn't understood at Harbor Point. Paperwork doesn't disappear, it travels. And sometimes, it circles back. I tried to ignore it. I threw the notice away. I washed my hands, as if that could erase the feel of the paper. For a week, nothing happened. My life returned to routine, or at least the version of routine you can maintain after you've been reminded that your name exists in places you can't see. Then I began noticing the accommodations. Not accommodations I made intentionally. Accommodations my body made. Every time I had to sign something, my pen would hover for an extra beat. Every time I filled out a form online, I would scroll back up to check a field I'd already completed. When a screen asked me to confirm, I felt a wave of unease that didn't match the situation. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but the dread grew in small ways, like mold in a corner you pretend you don't see. At my new job, I found myself avoiding certain tasks. I would volunteer for work that kept me away from the administrative side. I became known as someone who liked hands-on work, someone who didn't want to deal with documentation. It wasn't true. I was just terrified of leaving marks, because that's what forms are. Marks. I started saving copies of everything. Receipts, emails, confirmation numbers. I began taking screenshots of online submissions before hitting submit, as if I needed proof that I had done it correctly. I bought a small file box and labeled folders with dates. My friends joked that I was becoming organized. I laughed with them, because explaining the truth would have made me sound unstable. The truth was, I was trying to defend myself against the possibility that one day an error would ripple outward from something I did, and I would have no proof that I had followed the rules. Then came the first real sign that it wasn't just anxiety. I was at the pharmacy picking up a prescription. The place was bright and sterile, smelling of sanitizer and plastic. A line formed behind me. The clerk scanned my ID, tapped at the computer, frowned slightly. "Huh," she said. My stomach tightened. "What?" "It's fine," she said quickly, that practiced customer service calm. "Just, the system's showing a flag. Give me 1 second." A flag. The word hit me like a physical thing. She stepped away to speak to a supervisor. I could hear her voice, low. I couldn't hear the supervisor's response. I stared at the counter, at the small plexiglass barrier, at the little sign reminding customers to have their insurance ready. My hands were clenched around my wallet so hard the edges dug into my palms. When the clerk returned, she smiled too brightly. "Okay," she said. "All set. It was just a missing date on a previous authorization. Someone entered it without, and it triggered a review. It's cleared now." Missing date. My mouth went dry. A missing date? Yeah, she said, shrugging. It happens. Just one of those things. One of those things. I took the bag and walked out into the cold air of the parking lot, my breath coming out in white bursts. Cars idled. Snow sat in dirty piles near the curbs. The bag in my hand felt heavier than it should have. That was the moment the dread changed shape. It wasn't just that my name had been on Caleb Mercer's case. It was that the same kind of small omission had begun appearing in my own life, like the world was echoing it back to me. A missing date, a small blank space, a minor discrepancy. The kind of thing that shouldn't matter until it does. After that, the signs became harder to ignore. A letter from my landlord about a renewal notice, and the date field was blank. A bill paid online that showed pending for days longer than it should. A credit report update that listed an inquiry I couldn't remember authorizing, then vanished the next week as if it had never existed. Each time, I felt that same cold sensation in my chest, that sense of being reviewed by something invisible. I started dreaming about the Harbor Point office. In the dreams, the printers never stopped. Paper fed through them endlessly, streaming out like a tongue of white noise, piling up on the floor until it reached my knees. Janice Kerr stood at the edge of the pile, watching me with that neutral expression. "Follow the checklist," she would say. In the dreams, I tried. I would flip through pages, check boxes, sign lines, write dates, but the ink would smear. The dates would disappear. The forms would come back stamped with red words. Incomplete, rejected, returned. I would wake up with my heart pounding, the taste of toner in my mouth. My hands curled like they were gripping paper. One afternoon, months after the letter, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I had started avoiding unknown numbers. Unknown numbers feel like doors you didn't mean to open, but I answered anyway. "Marianne Holt?" a man asked. "Yes," I said, my voice too thin. "My name is Peter Vance," he said. "I'm calling regarding a document processed under your intake credentials at Harbor Point Administrative Services." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the phone tighter. "I don't work there anymore," I said. "I understand," he said. His tone was calm, professional, and that made it worse. "This is not about employment. This is about record integrity." "Record integrity," he continued. "We are conducting an audit of a determination chain associated with case number." He read it out. Caleb Mercer's number. My stomach turned. "There was a discrepancy noted in the intake stage," Peter said. "A missing signature date. The file was routed to review with a note. We need to confirm the circumstances." I swallowed. My mouth felt dry. I followed the procedure," I said. "I'm sure you did," he replied, and the casual certainty in his voice made my skin tighten. "This is routine. Routine. Another word that means nothing until it means everything." "I routed it with a note," I said. "It was minor." Peter paused. I heard paper shifting on his end, the faint click of a keyboard. "Yes," he said. "That's what the system indicates." I tried to steady my breathing. "So what's the problem?" Peter hesitated, just long enough for dread to bloom into something sharper. "The file was accepted at review," he said. Then it moved forward. The missing date was not corrected at that stage. It should have been returned to intake for completion. I stared at the wall in front of me. It was painted a pale beige. There was a small stain near the baseboard I'd been meaning to clean. A missing date, not corrected. Peter went on. The determination was issued. The subject appealed. The appeal was denied. The subject then filed a civil complaint alleging procedural harm. My throat tightened. Procedural harm. "Yes," Peter said. "They are claiming that the file's acceptance, despite the discrepancy, contributed to a sequence of denial events. They are alleging that proper protocol was not followed, and that it altered the timeline." Altered the timeline. Butterfly effect. But he didn't say that. Of course he didn't. Systems don't acknowledge their own ripples. They call them timelines and sequences and protocol. "I didn't deny anything," I said, suddenly, my voice rising. "I was intake. I just routed it." "I know," Peter said. "This is not an accusation. We are simply documenting touch points." "Touch points," The word made my stomach knot. A touch point is where you touched something, where you left a mark, Peter said. To confirm, you made a judgment call to route rather than reject. Is that correct? I could have lied. I could have said, no, I rejected it. Someone else must have routed it. I could have tried to erase myself from the chain. But the system already had my name. It had my credentials. It had my note. Yes, I said quietly. Yes, I routed it. Peter's voice softened, just slightly, as if he were speaking to someone delicate. Thank you, he said. That's all I needed. You may be contacted again if counsel requests clarification. Counsel, I repeated, my voice barely there. Yes, he said. Have a good day, Miss Holt. The call ended. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, even after the line went silent. Outside my window, Cleveland winter pressed its gray face against the glass. The street below was quiet. A bus passed, tires hissing on slush. Inside, my apartment felt sealed. Touch points. Counsel. Audit. Record integrity. All words that don't bleed, but can still ruin you. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building creak, listening to my neighbor's shower run, listening to the distant siren of an ambulance somewhere far away. My mind kept returning to the moment in intake, the blank date, the choice I made because it was late and I wanted to be helpful. I remembered Janice's voice. No deviations. I remembered the checklist line about minor discrepancies. I remembered my note. Signature present, date missing. Please advise. Please advise. As if asking politely would protect me. In the dark, I realized the real horror. It wasn't that I had broken the rules. It was that I had followed them in a way that allowed something worse to happen, and no one could point to a single moment to stop it. Systems love distributed responsibility. It makes harm untraceable. In the weeks after Peter Vance's call, my life began to narrow, but not in dramatic ways. It narrowed like a hallway you don't notice is tightening until you turn around and realize you can't stretch your arms out anymore. I stopped signing up for anything new. No memberships, no subscriptions, no applications. I avoided anything that required my name to be entered into a database. I began paying for things in cash more often, even though it was inconvenient. I hated leaving trails. At work, I declined promotions that involved oversight, forms, approvals. I became smaller on purpose. Friends noticed. My sister, Angela Holt, asked if I was okay. I told her I was tired. I told her I was stressed. She suggested therapy, and I nodded and changed the subject. How do you explain that you are afraid of a blank date? How do you explain that your dread is not about what happened, but about the possibility that you are always one small accommodation away from reshaping someone else's life? One morning, 6 months after Peter's call, I received another letter. This one did have a return address, Harbor Point Administrative Services, Office of Compliance. The logo was embossed. The paper was thick enough to cut. Inside was a request for a statement. Formal. Legal language. It asked me to describe, in my own words, the circumstances under which I routed case number Caleb Mercer without a signature date. It included a line. Your response will become part of the official record. Official record. I held the letter with both hands. My kitchen light made the paper glow. The words looked carved into the page. I felt my breathing become shallow. I could write the statement. I could tell the truth. I could say it was late. It felt minor. I used the checklist discretion. I could admit I made a judgment call, or I could refuse. I could ignore it, pretend I never received it. But I knew what ignoring does. It creates gaps. It creates blanks. And blanks, I had learned, do not stay blank. They get filled by someone else. That was the core horror. The thing that made my everyday life feel poisoned. You can do nothing, and the system will still act. You can follow instructions, and the system will still harm. You can be careful, and your name will still appear on documents you never meant to touch. I sat down at my kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. I picked up a pen. I wrote the date at the top, carefully. Month, day, year. I wrote my name beneath it, Mary Ann Holt, and then I stopped because my hand was shaking. Not from fear of consequences, not from fear of being blamed, from fear of the act itself, of leaving another mark. of creating another touch point. I stared at the paper until the ink of the date seemed to deepen, as if it were soaking through to the other side. Then I remembered Caleb Mercer's file, that blank space where the date should have been. I remembered how small it looked, how harmless, and I understood something that made my stomach tighten. I wasn't afraid of making mistakes anymore. I was afraid of being correct. Because correct is what makes systems move. Correct is what turns people into steps. Correct is what makes the chain inevitable. I set the pen down. I took my hands off the page. And for the first time since Harbor Point, I did something I had never done before. I left the date on the paper. I left my name. And I refused to write the next line because I could feel, with a clarity that made my eyes water, that whatever I wrote next would become part of someone else's life. Not metaphorically, literally. The letter from compliance sat on my table all day, watching me with its embossed seal. By evening, the sun had faded, and the windows turned into mirrors. In the glass, I could see my reflection sitting there, small and still, trapped in the glow of my kitchen light. A person who once believed forms were just forms. A person who now understood that every blank space is a doorway, and that once you have opened one, you never stop hearing the sound of it closing behind you. Story 3. The Favor. The first time I noticed my life had started narrowing, I blamed the economy. That is what you do when doors close in ways that don't come with a reason. You choose a reason that everyone will accept. You tell yourself the timing is bad, the market is unstable, the world is shifting. You pick an explanation that doesn't require you to look too closely at the pattern, because patterns are where fear begins. I was 34 when it happened, old enough to understand that most lives are built from small decisions, but young enough to believe that, if I worked hard, I could still steer mine. Back then, my days had shape. Not perfect shape, not some idealized routine, but enough structure that I recognized myself moving through it. Wake up, coffee, a drive through the pale desert morning, the sun climbing over the mountains like it had nowhere else to be. Work, lunch in the break room, the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the slow procession of tasks, drive home, gym, dinner, sleep. A normal life built to feel safe. The company I worked for was called Saguaro Ridge Logistics, a name that sounded like it belonged on a highway sign. It was a private distribution outfit that serviced a cluster of smaller businesses scattered outside Tucson. Warehousing, routing, inventory, fleet schedules, the quiet machinery that keeps stores stocked and contracts fulfilled. It was not glamorous, it was dependable. The building sat on the edge of an industrial park that felt like it had been placed in the desert and forgotten. Low stucco structures, chain link fences, gravel lots, wind carrying dust and the occasional smell of diesel. At sunrise, the sky would go bruised purple over the mountains, and the metal loading docks would glow faintly with the promise of heat. Inside, it was always the same temperature, always the same light. The air conditioning ran year-round. The floor was polished concrete. The office area was a row of cubicles, and beyond that was the warehouse proper, cavernous and echoing, forklifts moving like patient insects between shelves, stacked high with boxes. People like routine out there. Routine keeps you alive when the heat hits and the days blur together. I was a scheduling coordinator, which meant I lived on screens. Route assignments, delivery windows, driver hours, everything organized into grids and codes. It sounds dull, but it's the kind of work that makes you feel powerful in a quiet way because you are controlling motion. You are deciding where people go and when. I liked that. I liked knowing that if I clicked the wrong box, a truck could show up at the wrong dock and waste an entire morning. I liked the weight of the consequences because they felt contained. You screw up, you fix it. The world stays inside the lines. Then, one Friday afternoon, I did a favor. It was such a small thing, I didn't even register it as a decision at the time. I only remember it because it was the moment my life tilted, and I did not feel it move. His name was Travis Lyle. Travis was one of those guys who always looked like he had been in a hurry for so long that his face forgot how to relax. He was late to meetings, late to the time clock, late to lunch, but he never seemed panicked. He moved like someone who had internalized urgency as a personality trait. You could hear him coming by the rhythm of his footsteps, quick and uneven. We weren't friends, not really. We were coworkers, which means we knew enough about each other to fill silence. I knew he had a kid. I knew he was always behind on bills. I knew he'd been written up twice for missed shifts. He knew I lifted weights after work. He knew I didn't drink much. He knew I hated when people chewed loud in the break room. That was the extent of it. That Friday, Travis leaned into my cubicle around 3:30, his face tight in that forced casual way people get when they're about to ask you for something. "Daniel," he said, voice low. "You got a minute?" I looked up from my screen. The routing grid was open, a sea of colored cells. My eyes were tired. My coffee had gone cold. "What's up?" I asked. He hesitated, like he was waiting for the right moment, then said, "I need a favor." Those words, right there, are always a fork in the road. Everyone knows it, even if they pretend they don't. Travis glanced over his shoulder toward the supervisor offices, then leaned closer. "I need someone to cover the last hour of my shift," he said. "Just the last hour. I'll make it up. I swear. It's just my kid's school called. They need me. It's important." He didn't say the kid's name. He didn't offer details. He didn't need to. The phrasing was designed to make refusal feel cruel. "I'm not on floor," I said automatically. "You know that." "I know," he said quickly. "But you're authorized. You've done floor coverage before. You've got the badge access. You just have to check out the outbound list and sign the doc form. No one will even care. It's 1 hour." I should have said no. Not because I didn't want to help, but because favors at Saguaro Ridge never stayed favors. They became expectations. They became silent debts. They became little hooks in you that someone could tug later. But it was Friday. The end of the week always makes you softer. It makes you think you can be generous, because the weekend feels like a reset. I asked, "Did you talk to Marlene?" Marlene was our shift supervisor. She ran the floor with a clipboard and a smile that never reached her eyes. Travis exhaled. "I can't," he said. "She'll say no. You know she'll say no. She's been looking for a reason to fire me." His eyes locked onto mine, intense. He added, softer, "I just need someone to vouch that I wasn't ditching. Just this once. Vouch. Another word that carries weight you never see coming." I sat back in my chair. The hum of the office lights seemed louder. Outside, through the small window, the desert sun was lowering, turning the parking lot into a white glare. "How does this work?" I asked, already halfway in. Travis's shoulders sagged with relief. "You just take my last doc check," he said. "Sign the outbound verification. I'll clock out early. You'll be the one on record for that last hour." On record. My eyes flicked down to the routing grid on my screen. Everything was numbers and names and timestamps. The system didn't care who did what, only who was listed. "You'll owe me," I said, half joking, trying to keep it light. Travis nodded quickly. "Yeah," he said. "Anything, I swear." He smiled, and for the first time, I saw something almost grateful in his face. A softness that made him look younger. That softness is what convinced me. I think about that now, how the human part of him, the part that looked like a father who didn't want to disappoint his kid, is what opened the door. "All right," I said. 1 hour. Travis let out a breath, clapped my shoulder, and said, "You're a lifesaver." He left fast, already pulling his phone out, already walking toward the time clock. I watched him go, then looked back at my screen and tried to shake off the faint unease settling in my chest. An hour is nothing. That is what I told myself. At 4:30, I walked into the warehouse and took over his outbound check. The warehouse at that time of day is its own world. The air smells like cardboard and rubber. The ceiling fans turn slowly, pushing warm air in lazy circles. The loading bays yawn open to the bright desert outside, and the sun slants in, making long bars of light across the floor. A driver named Mason Kerr was at Dock 3, waiting for the final paperwork. Mason was a quiet guy, late 40s, sun-leathered skin, tired eyes. He nodded when he saw me. "Travis?" he asked. "Had to leave," I said. "I'm covering." Mason shrugged. "Whatever works." I checked the outbound list. Pallet scanned. Inventory matched. I signed the verification form. My signature, on the line where Travis's should have been, Daniel Reyes. At the time, it felt like nothing. Like writing my name on a piece of paper that would be filed and forgotten. I handed Mason the form. He tucked it into his clipboard. The forklift beeped as someone backed up. The truck door rolled down with a metallic slam. Then Mason climbed into his cab, turned the engine over, and pulled out of Dock 3. He drove toward the access road, the truck's tires crunching gravel. And that was the moment, the actual moment, where the chain began. I just didn't know it. The next week, Travis showed up on time. He brought me a coffee without being asked, set it on my desk with a grin. "Thanks again," he said. "You saved my ass." "No problem," I said, feeling that small glow people feel when they've done something decent. The company moved on. The system digested my signature and filed it away. My life returned to shape for about 2 months. Then, one afternoon, Marlene called me into her office. Her office was small, windowless, decorated with motivational posters that looked like they'd been printed in the early 2000s. A fake plant sat in the corner, dust on its leaves. Marlene gestured for me to sit. She didn't offer coffee. Her smile was thin. "Daniel," she said, "I need to ask you about an outbound verification you signed in late March." My stomach tightened. "Okay," I said. She slid a file across her desk. On top was a copy of the doc form. My signature stared up at me. Daniel Reyes. The date was the Friday I covered Travis's last hour. Marlene tapped the paper with her fingernail. "Do you remember this?" "Yeah," I said. My mouth felt dry. "I covered for Travis." Marlene's eyes narrowed. "Did you have authorization?" "I was authorized for floor coverage," I said carefully. "That's not what I asked," she replied. "Did you have authorization to assume his responsibility for that shift?" I hesitated. In systems, hesitation is guilt. "I didn't think I needed it," I said. "It was just an hour." Marlene leaned back, folding her hands. "Do you know where this shipment went?" I glanced at the file, scanning the codes. "It's a standard outbound," I said. "Retail supply run." Marlene stared at me for a long moment, then said, "That truck was involved in an incident on the highway outside town." The words landed heavy. "An incident?" I repeated. "A collision," she said. "Not fatal, but serious. There's an insurance dispute now about liability, timing, and load verification. The driver claims he was released late. The client claims the load was incomplete. The documentation is messy. Messy." My eyes flicked back to the form. Everything looked normal. Check boxes, codes, my signature. Marlene said, "Your name is on the verification. You are the last recorded person to confirm the load." I felt a strange coldness spread through my chest. "I just signed," I said. "Everything matched." "I'm not accusing you," Marlene said, and that was how I knew she was. "I'm saying your name is in the chain. That means you will be contacted." My throat tightened. "Contacted by who?" "Insurance," she said. "Possibly counsel." Counsel, another word that makes your blood run cold. Marlene's expression softened slightly, as if she were giving me a kindness. "In the future," she said, "don't do favors. It makes things complicated." Then she smiled, and I saw something behind it. Not cruelty, but satisfaction. The system had found a way to punish Travis without touching him. It had found a way to punish me for being useful. I walked out of her office with my heart pounding and went back to my desk. I told myself it would be a phone call, a quick statement. Yes, I signed the form. Yes, the load was complete. Then it would be over. That is how we lie to ourselves when we don't want to see the pattern. The call came 3 days later. A woman named Evelyn Cho introduced herself as an adjuster. Her voice was calm, smooth, practiced. "Mr. Reyes," she said, "I'm calling regarding shipment verification for Saguaro Ridge Logistics. Specifically, a dock release on March 28th. Do you recall signing the outbound verification?" "Yes," I said, my voice tight. I covered the dock check. Evelyn asked questions that sounded simple but felt like traps. What time did the truck leave? Did I observe the load myself? Did I note any irregularities? Did I receive any complaints from the driver? Did I speak to anyone about delays? The truth was, I didn't remember. It had been an hour. It had been routine. It had been a favor. I don't know, I admitted. I just followed the checklist. Evelyn's voice didn't change. The checklist requires verification of pallet count and seal integrity, she said. Did you verify the seal? Yes, I said, though I wasn't sure. Silence on the line, then her pen scribbling. The sound transmitted faintly through the phone. Evelyn said, "Thank you for your time. You may be contacted again." After the call, I sat at my desk, staring at the routing grid, the sea of numbers and names. The office felt different. The hum of the lights felt more intense. The click of keyboards sounded like teeth. For the first time, I understood that my life was not separate from the system. My name, my signature, my presence, those were data points. Those were anchors. That night, I went home and opened a beer I didn't want, just to quiet the tightness in my chest. I told myself it would pass. It did not pass. It spread. The incident on the highway was not something I saw. It was not something I experienced directly. It was a story, a file, a chain of emails and calls. It existed in the administrative world. And yet, it began to reach into my everyday life. Not in dramatic ways, but in small, cumulative ones that made my routines feel contaminated. I started being careful with everything. Too careful. When I signed anything, I read it twice. When I agreed to anything verbally, I repeated it back, as if creating a recording in someone's memory could protect me later. When coworkers asked me to cover shifts, even my closest friend at work, Javier Soto, I declined with a polite smile. "Man, it's just an hour," Javier said once, laughing. I forced a laugh back, but my stomach twisted. "I can't," I said. "I'm busy." "Busy doing what?" "Protecting myself from the invisible chains you don't see until your name is in them." Travis, meanwhile, looked relieved. He avoided me in the weeks after Marlene's meeting. When our eyes met, he would glance away like he was looking at something bright. I told myself he was embarrassed. I did not yet understand that he was afraid. The second call came a month later. This one from a man named Graham Nettles, his voice sharper, impatient. "Mr. Reyes," he said, "I represent parties involved in a civil dispute. I'm going to ask you direct questions. Your cooperation is noted." Noted. Everything in that world is noted. Graham asked about the same form, but his questions were framed differently. Less about what I did, more about why. "Why were you signing a doc release in place of the assigned coordinator?" he asked. "It was a favor," I said, and the word sounded childish in my mouth. "A favor," Graham repeated, as if tasting it. "Was it authorized?" "I was authorized to cover," I said. "That's not what I asked," he said. My mouth went dry. "No," I admitted. "Not officially." There was a pause, then Graham said, "Interesting." After the call, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't type. I went outside to the parking lot, stood in the sun, and tried to breathe. The desert wind was hot and dry, carrying the smell of asphalt. I stared at the mountains in the distance, the way they sat unmoving, ancient, indifferent. I wished I could be like that, unmoving, not part of any chain, but I was. Weeks turned into months, and the dispute dragged on. It moved through paperwork and emails and quiet meetings in offices I never saw. I was a name on a form, a contact in a file, a person who could be summoned to confirm or deny. It should have faded into the background. It should have become a nuisance. Instead, it became a lens through which I began seeing my whole life. Because once you understand that a favor can become a liability, you start looking for all the other places you might have unknowingly signed your name into something larger. I began remembering old decisions differently. The time I let a stranger borrow my phone in a grocery store parking lot. The time I gave someone directions. The time I vouched for a friend's rental application. The time I signed as a witness on a neighbor's document because she asked nicely. All those moments suddenly felt like open doors. I started avoiding them. My life narrowed. Not because I was forced, but because I chose it. I stopped going out after work. I stopped meeting friends at bars. I stopped dating because dating is full of favors, emotional ones, small accommodations, decisions that shape other people's lives. I told myself I was focusing on myself. In reality, I was afraid of influencing anything. Even at the gym, I became quieter. I stopped spotting strangers. I stopped offering advice. I stopped making eye contact. When people asked me simple questions, like, "Can you watch my bag for a second?" my chest tightened. I began to feel like my name was dangerous. That is how the butterfly effect works in the present. It does not show you the full chain. It just teaches your body that small decisions are not small. Then, one evening, Travis found me in the warehouse. It was near closing. The loading bays were half shut, the sun low and orange, dust hanging in the air like suspended ash. Travis approached slowly, hands in his pockets, his face strained. "Daniel," he said. I kept walking. "I'm busy," I said. "No," he said, stepping in front of me. "Please, just hear me." I stopped, heart pounding. Travis swallowed. His eyes flicked toward the office, then back. "I'm sorry," he said. The words hit me harder than I expected. "For what?" I asked, though I already knew. Travis's jaw tightened. "For asking you," he said. "For making it your problem." I stared at him. The warehouse felt huge around us, the air heavy, the forklift lights casting long shadows. "You needed to leave," I said, my voice flat. Travis nodded. "Yeah," he said. "But I didn't tell you everything." My stomach turned. "What do you mean?" Travis looked down at the concrete floor. He spoke quietly, like he was afraid the building itself would hear. "That shipment," he said, "it wasn't clean." The air seemed to thicken. "What?" I asked. Travis licked his lips, his face pale. "There was a pallet that wasn't supposed to be on it," he said. I knew it. Marlene knew it. It was one of those things everyone pretends not to notice, because noticing means paperwork, and paperwork means audits. I stared at him. My mind tried to reject the words. "You're saying," I began. "I'm saying," Travis interrupted, voice shaking, "that I needed someone else's name on the release. I needed distance. I needed it to not be me." My blood went cold. "You used me," I said, the words barely a whisper. Travis flinched. "I didn't think it would blow up," he said. "I thought it would just disappear into the system like everything else." Disappear into the system. That phrase, right there, is the real horror. The belief that the system will swallow harm and make it nobody's fault. My hands curled into fists. "Why me?" I asked. Travis looked at me with something like despair. "Because you're reliable," he said. "Because you don't cause trouble. Because you're the kind of guy who does the right thing when someone asks." The warehouse lights hummed overhead. A distant beep echoed as someone reversed a forklift. I stood there, heart hammering, and felt something inside me crack. Not rage, not panic, but that deep, sinking understanding that my life had narrowed because I was trying to protect myself from chains, and all along, someone else had been using my reliability as a link. Travis swallowed again. "They're going to throw me under," he said. "Marlene, the company, everyone. They're going to say it was me." And it was, but... His voice broke slightly. "But you're in it now too." I stared at him, and in that moment I understood why my life felt prearranged. Not because of fate. Because systems choose paths of least resistance, and I had been making myself the path of least resistance my entire life. I took a step back. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Travis's eyes were wet. "Nothing," he said. I can't sleep. I keep thinking about it. About you." I didn't respond. Travis stood there for a long moment, then said, softer, "I'm sorry." Again, like repetition could change the past. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing between shelves of stacked boxes. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen with the lights off. The window over the sink showed the dark desert outside, a faint glow from distant streetlights, the sky huge and black. I kept replaying Travis's words. I needed someone else's name on the release. I had been thinking of the favor as something that redirected my life, incrementally, quietly. But now I saw it more clearly. The favor wasn't a detour, it was a substitution. My name had been used as a shield. And because my name was on the record, the system treated me as responsible. Because the system does not care about intention. It cares about documentation. It cares about where the blame can stick. Over the next week, my phone rang more often. Unknown numbers. Voicemails left in crisp, professional tones. Requests for statements. Requests for clarity. The dispute was escalating. At work, Marlene began watching me differently. Not openly. Just in the way her eyes followed me a fraction longer. The way she paused when she passed my desk, as if making sure I stayed in place. I began to feel like I was being managed, not by a person, but by the system itself, nudged into the role it needed me to play. Then, one morning, I arrived at my desk and found an envelope taped to my monitor. No return address. My name written in careful block letters, Daniel Reyes. My mouth went dry. I peeled it off, hands trembling, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of the outbound verification form, the same one, my signature circled in red ink, and beneath it, written in that same careful handwriting, were 4 words. You were always reliable. I stared at the sentence until my vision blurred. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. It felt like someone describing a function. Reliable, in a system, means predictable. It means usable. It means you will do what you are supposed to do. Reliable is not a compliment when you realize someone is using it. I sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath me, and looked around the office. Rows of cubicles, monitors glowing, people typing, the steady hum of fluorescent lights. Everything normal, and yet, I felt, with a clarity that made my throat tighten, that my life was now arranged around that one favor, not as punishment, not as karma, but as consequence. My relationships, my choices, my routines, my caution, my isolation, all downstream. I thought about the chains I had been avoiding, the favors I had refused, the doors I had stopped holding open. I thought about how my life had narrowed because I was terrified of shaping someone else's outcome. And I realized the cruelest part. The system didn't need me to make new decisions anymore. It had already gotten what it wanted. It had my name on paper. It had my reliability in ink. And now, every day I lived, every cautious choice I made, every door I didn't open, every conversation I avoided, was just me continuing the chain, reinforcing it, confirming to the world that the version of me who did that favor was still here, still compliant, still predictable. I stared at my hands on the desk, at the faint impression of pen calluses on my fingers. Then, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened my email, found Evelyn Cho's last message, and began typing a reply. Not an apology, not a denial, a statement, a record. My name at the bottom. Because I finally understood that the only way to stop being a link in someone else's chain is to become, in the system's eyes, unreliable, to refuse the role, to break the predictability. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Outside, the desert sun rose higher, washing the parking lot in hard light. Inside, the office hummed, steady and indifferent, waiting for me to do what I was supposed to do. And for the first time, I let the cursor blink without answering it, because I could feel, deep in my chest, that whatever I chose next would not just affect me, it would ripple outward. It always did. You have reached the end of tonight's sequence, the last visible step before the chain disappears back into ordinary life, where actions return to doing what they have always done, quietly, efficiently, without remembering who started them. If any of these stories stayed with you, if you felt something tighten when the consequences arrived without warning, if you caught yourself thinking about the smallest moments in your own life, the ones you never logged, never documented, never thought to question, the favors that felt polite, the shortcuts that felt reasonable, the choices that felt too minor to matter, do not let the story end here. Subscribe to continue exploring systems people trust, systems built to move smoothly, to absorb human decisions, to carry actions forward long after intention has faded, where danger does not announce itself, it propagates, and where the most unsettling realization is not that something went wrong, but that everything worked. Tell me in the comments which story followed you the longest, which decision felt uncomfortably familiar, which moment made you reconsider a kindness you once gave freely, the favor that lingered, the form that felt heavier. the signature that never quite faded, or the instant where you realize the chain did not end with the person who began it. Like the video so these stories reach others who believe the smallest choices are harmless, who think consequences only belong to dramatic moments, who trust that if something mattered, it would feel important at the time. And if you have your own story, a moment you dismissed that later reshaped your life, a favor that redirected more than you expected, a decision that followed you quietly into the present, a chain you did not recognize until it was complete, you are always welcome to share it. Send your experience to the business email in the channel bio, and it may become part of a future Entity Shadows episode. Thank you for listening, for staying present a little longer, for examining the choices you usually let pass without thought, for understanding that cause does not need drama to be permanent. And until next time, watch the small decisions. Pay attention to what continues. And if your life begins to feel narrower, more precise, more arranged than you remember choosing, do not assume nothing happened. Because sometimes the most frightening chains are not forged through intention, but through moments so ordinary you never realized you were linking them together. And remember, the dark awaits.